1 minute. All right, let's pray. Lord, we do ask that you would be with us now, that your spirit would animate our class time, that you would help us to grow in our knowledge of your word and even in our facility for reading it, and that we might be strengthened because of this in our own individual Bible reading, in our studies together as a church, and in our witness. So we ask that you would be glorified by what happens in this class hour, and that you would use what happens in this class hour to further your glory outside of this hour. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So we are continuing. Where are we? Class 3? This is class 3. Class 3 of Biblical Theology. Remind me, what is biblical theology? As we said both last week and the week before, it does not just mean good. It does not just mean good theology. What is biblical theology? Greg? Yeah, we're letting the Bible set the terms for how we organize, what we're thinking about, because the Bible itself is a coherent entity. It is one of the things we see is that largely, now not every book of the Bible is narrative, but largely the Bible unfolds a history called redemptive history, a single story from beginning to end. The Bible is not just a collection of truth propositions. You can't just grab any individual sentence and grab another one and you pop them all together and synthesize that. That's not the type of literature the Bible is, most of it. Some of Proverbs is like that. But for the most part, we've got story, and then we've got letters and prophecy and poems, and how all these things fit together. We are concerned with how the Bible presents itself, what type of literature it is, and its natural shape, its organic shape, some would say. So we're concerned with the shape of the Bible itself. So rather than coming to the Bible with our own questions, which is fine, in fact, that's a very necessary and important thing. But before we do that, before we do systematic theology, we kind of have to understand the Bible on its own terms, otherwise we won't be able to do good systematic theology. So before we start asking questions of the text in the sense of like, oh, what should I think about X, Y, or Z, we need to understand the Bible as the Bible presents itself so that we can properly draw out meaning for answering those other questions. So biblical theology is a logical precursor to doing systematic theology. And last week we plotted a timeline. We plotted a timeline of the entire Bible. And this timeline doesn't contain every single thing that could possibly be on it. It doesn't contain every single event that happens in the Bible. But as we talked about last week, even this, we started to kind of do biblical theology, where we look and we said we were asking ourselves, what are the key events? That, like, what does the Bible put forward as, like, this is a key event, and this is kind of like part of the main line of the story. Kind of the chapter headings naturally, as it were. And I think we did a pretty good job. I gave you a beginning and end point mostly, and then we kind of filled this in. And we mentioned last week that we're going to do one more little bit of scaffolding, one more little bit of building on this timeline, and then I'll turn it into a nice looking, it won't be as scribbly as what you get on the board, a nice little handout for us to have as we work through the final 3 weeks, which will be looking at 3 different themes that arise naturally from the Bible and seeing how they unfold across this timeline. So we're going to look at the theme of prophet, the theme of priesthood, and the theme of kingship. And so we'll start right at the beginning and see, like, how do these unfold? How does the idea of prophet unfold from beginning to end? How does and at each stage? How does the idea of kingship appear at the beginning, and how does it unfold across each stage? So on and so forth. So in order for us to do that work productively, it's good to have this kind of in our head, the big picture, the timeline, so that then we can see how each theme that we look at unfolds across the timeline. And so for today, the final piece of scaffolding we wanted to add, we think we did a good job on events, persons and events, but we're going to add in covenants. Covenants is very, very important. This is important for you guys. Our church is named Grace Covenant Baptist Church. And so when someone asks you, if they do, I actually don't know if anyone has ever asked me when I tell the name of my church, but if someone asks you, what does that mean? What does covenant mean? Or why is that in your name? We'll probably want to have an answer. Probably want to have a good answer for that. And so the covenants are extremely important for the narrative structure, for the macro structure of the Bible as it presents itself. We'll give you a really clear example of this right towards the end of the class. But first, define for me. Define for me what a covenant is. What is a covenant? We're talking about covenants. What is a covenant? Samuel. Yeah, so this starts to get us there. There is actually, often we simplify, and when we say covenant, we'll get rid of that. When we say covenant, we do think something like a contract, an agreement. And so that's a good initial kind of cognitive framework for thinking, okay, I'm thinking in terms of agreement and what goes along with that, like the things Samuel said, you make promises, the other party makes promises, sometimes there's stipulations for what happens if you violate, and so on and so forth. That's a good initial framework for thinking about covenants, but actually it can lead you astray. You can miss the mark if you just think of covenant as a synonym for contract. Like, oh, that's an old way of saying contract, and contract is just what we call it today. There's actually a distinction, because even in the ancient world, they had both covenants and they had contracts, and they weren't quite the same thing. Does anyone maybe have a guess or any sort of impression? What's the difference? Or might be some of the differences between a covenant and a contract? Well, no, I think you have promises in contracts, equally so. Samuel? Yeah, that's probably the best way to summarize the key difference is the relational aspect. Contracts were all thing oriented, service oriented, right? So if I contract with a plumber, I say you are going to do the X amount of work for me, and then I will pay you. They had that in the Old Testament or in the ancient world, and that type of arrangement wasn't called a covenant. That was a contract, right? We set this on this day. You agree to do this amount of service. I agree to give this payment. Maybe you would have stipulations what happens if they violate, and that's a contract. And it's service oriented. It's thing oriented. It has a natural terminus where you've done the thing that I asked you to do, or you've given me the things that I want. Like you make little verbal contracts all the time. I ask for the donut at the donut counter, and then they give me the donut, and I give them the money, and it's over. And it's done, and we've each fulfilled our part of the agreement. And so that's a contract, thing-oriented, person-oriented. What the contract creates, when you create the contract, is a specific obligation to accomplish a very specific thing or to give a specific thing, and then you're done. Then it's over. That's a contract. What a covenant creates is a relationship. Covenant is person-oriented. So if you think about like person A and person B, with a contract, the contract is focused on a thing or a service. Covenant is focused on the parties. What the covenant does is it creates a relationship between two parties, two people, and the focus on the covenant is the relationship. Now, there will be similarities. There will be stipulations, there will be obligations, but generally speaking, covenants were kind of forever, which didn't mean you couldn't break them, didn't mean you couldn't make new covenants, but in general, all covenants were kind of viewed as we make this and it's forever. It continues because we have now created a relationship between you and I. And theoretically, that relationship would continue forever. Obviously, there were ways to break covenants. And so here's an example. What is another covenant that we all know and it happens all the time today? Marriage, right? So marriage is a covenant. So when the two people get married, they're not creating a contract with each other, they're creating a relationship between. That's why in the marriage ceremony, in the vows, you never have a delimitation of like household duties. It's never like, I promise to do the dishes on Thursdays at 7, and I promise to take out the trash, and then I promise to wash the car. Like, you never have that, right? Because that stuff will ebb and flow and change. What you're creating is a relationship between two parties. And that relationship will be the context in which, yeah, there's going to be exchange of services and goods and all sorts of things like that. And then there will be stipulations of what it means. But the obligation with a contract is fulfill the service or the thing. The obligation with a covenant is be loyal to this other person. That loyalty what it looks like might change, but that's the obligation. I'm going to be loyal to the person that I've now entered into this relationship with. As Samuel mentioned, often in the ancient world, especially, the covenants involved, not always, but a stronger party covenanting with a weaker party. We kind of distinguish between like the suzerain vassal, where you've got like the strong nation, and they make a relationship with the weaker nation. But in contracts, you had negotiation. There really isn't negotiation with a covenant. Like that's not, because we're not dealing with goods and services. We're wanting to make a relationship either between, it can be between two nations, it can be between two families, two people, but the thing that's being created with a covenant is a relationship. And even in the documents of the ancient world, you had a very clear distinction between when it was just a contract, like, oh, we're just contracting between some services or goods, or when we're making a covenant between two parties. Questions, thoughts, just on that kind of basic definition? If you're just walking in with us, as we said, we are adding one last little bit of scaffolding to our kind of big picture of the storyline of the Bible, which we filled in pretty good last week. I think you guys did a good job. Now we're adding in the last kind of piece for the big picture, which is the biblical idea of covenants, and specifically the covenants in the Bible. So we wanted to start with a definition. I mean, it's in our name, Grace Covenant Baptist Church. So we probably want to be able to talk a little bit about it. Jose. Yes. No. That's a good question. Often, when you look in both the Bible and in just wider ancient law and records, often covenants were sealed or inaugurated with some sort of blood, sacrifice, meal. Those two go hand in hand almost always. But no, covenants did not require blood. I'm trying to think. I know we have some in the Bible. I'm trying to think what would have been general practice in other nations, but the answer is no. Often they did, but you did not need to have blood to enact a covenant. Other questions? All right. We got our kind of definition of covenant, and the reason why we are giving kind of a whole class, we're putting this on the level of scaffolding, of the very structure of the Bible, is because as we do biblical theology, as we read the Bible, as we kind of let the Bible set the categories, we find that covenants that God makes with man, God makes with his creation, sort of form the backbone. In biblical theology, we often talk about, we talked about this in the first class, but we often talk about like the center. Sometimes like people are like, oh, what's the center? What's the main theme of the Bible? That's probably like a wrong-headed question. You probably can't like narrow, or you get so general that it's meaningless. Like, but God, okay, well, yes, that's an easy answer. Okay, God is the center of the Bible. But one of the key contenders, even though it's maybe not the best question, is covenant. And for the reason, because of how important it is to the structure. So I certainly think that is a true statement. The covenant kind of forms the backbone. You'll see, even we've plotted these key events on our history timeline. You'll see how they kind of line up with the biblical covenants. All right, yeah, Mike. Yes, yeah. Yeah, huge in terms of just the context where it's like everyone, kind of understand this, and we understand it today too, even though we don't use the word as often. But marriage is still one of those ones where I think even in general populace, a lot of people at least still kind of have that category. But certainly then, I mentioned earlier, you've got all sorts of analogs, like specific forms of covenants. You've got cases where like a stronger party will covenant with a weaker party, and you've got cases where they kind of seem to be more on the same level. And what goes along with all of that is this highly relational nature where, okay, maybe today we feel a little more isolated, a little more individualistic, but certainly not in every culture today, and not in basically any culture back then. We understood this relational aspect incredibly important, and we see that that's very true in terms of how God relates to us, how He wants to relate to us. That there is a dimension of relationship. This is a thing that God is creating, that He wants to enter into with His people. In fact, that He does from the very beginning. All right, so let's start with our sort of first covenant, basically, that we find in the Bible. And what we're looking at today, for some of you, some of your brains will be ready, depending on your background reading or whatnot, with what we would call a theologically posited covenant, like a covenant that's kind of inferred, um, or we use like a covenant of redemption, like the covenant between the Father and the Son to redeem a people. That's not what we're looking at today. We're looking at like the narrative covenants, the backbone structure of the Bible. And so the first one is, and this is also the reason why every time we picked an event, I asked us to put a person, because often that's the way we identify the covenants. But so right at the beginning, we have creation, and people call this all sorts of different things, but I'm just going to call it the Adamic covenant. The covenant with Adam. There is an Adamic covenant. This one is maybe the most controversial, actually, of the ones that's going to be popped on the board for one reason. Does anyone know the reason? Samuel. It's not called. It's not. Well, yeah. It's not called a covenant in Genesis 1 through 3. The word covenant is not used for. So like at no point does God say like I'm making a covenant in those words with Adam. However, so we'll take just a little bit of time to kind of walk through this. However, we all understand, and sometimes this is just the outworking of kind of a too simplistic way of thinking about word studies and how we read the Bible. So, for example, if we have a song that was written specifically for a wedding, there are a couple of these. I don't have any examples off the top of my head, but I looked this up to give this example, not for this class, but for something else. But you go look up songs that were written specifically for weddings, not just songs that came to be used for weddings, but look up songs that were written specifically for weddings. There are some out there. This was written for a wedding, come to become popular, used at wedding. I don't think in any of the ones I found use the word wedding or marriage or groom or husband or bride uh, in the actual lyrics. Right? It's written for a wedding, but it didn't have those words. Well, it's like certainly the wedding is an important context for understanding the meaning of this song, even though it doesn't use those words. It uses words like "oh my love" and like all the metaphors and all these things, but not wedding, groom, bride. So, but you would be like, this is a wedding song. This is important for understanding. This is a wedding song. So we look in form, and we've already talked about what a covenant is. We can recognize that a covenant is happening. So that's kind of like the basic argument. We recognize this is what's happening, whether the word is used or not. But then we do have other evidences as well, besides just the general. Well, we can see this is what's happening. God has created man. He's entering into a relationship with him. There's something binding and solemnized about it. Like that, I mean, that's an important part of the covenant as well. We didn't mention earlier, because not just any relationship is necessarily covenantal. Sometimes there already exists a relationship, and then you enter into a covenant, and that kind of formalizes it in some way. Sometimes there was no relationship, and then the covenant is what creates it totally. So there's a formalized aspect. But we see that in what happens with Adam in Genesis 1. And so besides just the reality of, okay, this seems to be what's happening, we also have a few other evidences. I'll mention just a few. One is the fact that actually when God makes his covenant with David, also the word covenant does not occur in that passage. Uh, eh, so we go, well, how do we know it's a covenant? The rest of the Bible refers to it often as a covenant. The covenant that you made quotes that initial situation, and it refers to it as the covenant that you made with David, the Davidic covenant. So the rest of the Bible makes it clear what happened here with David was a covenant, even though God didn't use the words, "I'm making a covenant with you," in that passage. Uh, then we have the question, well, does that happen with Adam anywhere? I think it does. Does anyone know off the top of their head? Hosea 6:7. Hosea 6. Do you have that open? You want to read it? Yeah. Hosea 6:7. Okay, yes. So we've got this passage in Hosea where God is condemning the people for their faithlessness to his covenant with them, right? You remember the whole kind of opening word image in Hosea, where with a husband and a wife and the unfaithful wife, and all throughout Hosea, God is dealing with his people as an unfaithful to the covenant people, and he says they, like Adam, transgressed the covenant. They violated the covenant, just like Adam did. You also have the fact that when we get to Noah, a lot of times this is how people kind of recognize the Adamic covenant, is they go backwards. When you get to Noah, uh, we have an explicit description that God is making a covenant with Noah, and it sounds quite familiar. What are some of the things that God says in the process of the whole Noah episode and in making a covenant with Noah? What are some of the things that God says to Noah? You guys remember? You want to flip over and Genesis 6 to 9, particularly hop towards the end of that, and you see what are some of the things you can just pull up. God, hmm? Multiply, fill the earth. He blessed them. He said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Um, he says, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And then he gives the sign. This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and that should be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. So one of the things you get in just the narrative structure of what's going on, particularly in Genesis 9, is this presentation of Noah as like a new Adam. Right? He's now the head of the new creation. He's given the creation mandate: be fruitful and multiply. And so he's now standing at the head of humanity, and he's in the same position as Adam. And so we recognize these parallels, and we go, oh, okay. So this is like what happened earlier with Adam. Also, uh, a sort of linguistic argument is the fact that God says, "I'm going to establish my covenant with you." In Hebrew, we have two words for making a covenant, or kind of upholding a covenant. The first one is the normal Hebrew word for cutting. So it's an idiom. It's, I'm going to cut a covenant with you. And that's the normal way of saying I'm going to make a covenant. There's another way that we talk in Hebrew, which is to say I'm going to kind of uplift, establish. Usually it comes into English as establish or confirm or uphold. And the other one, cut, usually comes into English as make. And by and large, there are arguably a couple exceptions to this. I don't even know if I agree with the exceptions. But by and large, there's a pretty clear distinction between the two terms throughout the whole Bible. Whenever cut is used, whenever make is used, that's like the beginning of the covenant. And whenever confirm or establish or uphold is used, it's referring to some previous covenant that is either being obeyed in some way or re-ratified. So whenever established or confirmed, upheld is used, it's assuming a previous covenant. And in the Noah episode, it never says make. It never says make a covenant. It says I'm going to establish my covenant with you. I'm going to uphold my covenant. I'm going to confirm my covenant. And so we recognize that there is some sense in which what's happening with Noah is a continuation. Now, God gives new stipulations. He adds on some things that were not said to Adam, but there is some sort of building on what has gone before. And so I've put these arrows here. And what I mean by these arrows is not a terminus, right? So it's not Adam done, Noah done. What I mean by these arrows is that there's a sort of building. So as we mentioned, in a very real sense, all covenants were kind of viewed as open-ended, like theoretically eternal. They could be ended, they could be broken, they could be nullified, but absent like a thing that does that, it was just kind of viewed like this covenant goes on, just like at every level, from every personal relationship up to the big ones. And so we're understanding that these covenants continue, and there is sort of a progression. So with Adam, we get purpose. We talked about this before. We're introduced to the very purpose of all of creation. The very purpose of creation and the very purpose of man within creation. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to priesthood, but we've got this theater of God's glory in the beginning, this kind of cosmic temple, this place where God is going to dwell, and then we've got the garden, which is kind of a mini temple. We often, I think like in all our paintings and everything, we usually don't capture this, but gardens in the ancient world were walled off, like it's not just an open-ended plot of land. We kind of picture like Eden, I think usually it's just like an open-ended plot of land. But, gardens were walled off. And you're right, there's an entrance to Eden. God places the cherubim at the entrance. There's, probably envision a wall. So we've got this miniature version of the cosmos. We've got this place where God walks. He walks with Adam. He dwells. And he promises Adam, or he blesses Adam, and a number of things. He says, be fruitful and multiply. He says, have dominion. And he says that again to Noah. You're going to have dominion over the birds of the air, the fish of the sea. And then God dwells with the people. So he promises to bless them, wants them to be fruitful and multiply. He wants them to be, he creates them in his image. We talked a little bit about this. We'll talk more when we get to kingship. But the fact that Adam was to be a sub-ruler under God, that he was to have dominion, to represent God to the creation, and he's blessed, he's going to multiply, he has a place to be with God, right? So he has a place, he has this blessing, he's going to be fruitful and multiply, and so you have these elements. And we also are introduced very early on to the problem, right? So in the whole Adamic covenant, we're given the purpose for mankind in context with the purpose of all of creation. All of creation is to be a theater of God's glory. mankind is to be the administrators of that, of God's glory in creation. And then there is a problem. Man violates the terms of the covenant. Man breaks it. God does give stipulations. You have to obey. And particularly, you have to obey by not eating the tree, eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And a lot of times people think of that as just kind of like an arbitrary test. Like, and certainly test is a right word, but they treat that as kind of like an arbitrary, like, here's a random tree. God says, don't eat from that. Um, and if you do, you have violated the terms of the covenant. And certainly there's an element of that is true. But we also want to reckon with the fact that it is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So what's going on with that? Why does God call it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And so what is it exactly? Like, remember, what did Satan promise? What did Satan promise will happen if you eat from this tree? Yeah, and you will be like God and having the knowledge of good and evil. And what did God say after they ate? Now they have taken this, upon themselves. Like, now they have the knowledge of good and evil. We don't let them take from the tree of life. So both Satan and God treat the tree as having some sort of effect. Whether it is purely kind of like sacramental, like it still could have been any tree, it is immaterial. Whether there was like something special in the fruit, like, I'm not saying anything like that. We don't need to specify that, but clearly there is something going on. And when you do a little bit of a study and you see what is this language, knowledge of good and evil, used throughout the rest of the Bible and in other ancient Near Eastern texts, and you recognize it's kind of dealing with this judicial, like, making those calls, like deciding what's good, what's evil, passing down judgment. So you get this recognition. Okay, what Adam and Eve were doing, what they were forbidden from doing, is usurping God's position. I determine what's good and evil. I determine the terms. I'm your creator. You're my creation. This is the theater of my glory. I determine the terms for how you are going to live and for what is good and what's evil. And Adam wants to usurp that for himself, or eventually he does. And then there's a very real recognition that is, in fact, what happened. Man is now going to decide good and evil for himself. That doesn't mean he suddenly becomes God and has that sovereign ability, but that's the kind of the situation that he finds himself in. He's like, well, I'm deciding for myself what's right and wrong. And it causes all sorts of problems. It's a violation of the terms of the covenant. Then there are covenant curses. As I said, there are often stipulations and curses. In this case, you will die. You're cast out of the garden. You don't get to enjoy my presence anymore. And so we've got the problem. We've got the purpose, right? We got the purpose for all of creation. Then we've got the problem. Then we get a promise. We do get a promise right away in the Adam narrative, right in the giving of the curses. We get Genesis 3:15, starting like in 3:14, 15:16, where God says, I'm going to put enmity between the offspring of the serpent, the offspring of the woman, and he will crush its head. And the serpent's offspring will crush, or he will crush the serpent's head, and the serpent will crush his heel. There's going to be kind of this mutual destruction. When a serpent, it uses this language of crush, but like certain serpent gets the heel, like if it's a poisonous serpent, that's still a fatal wound, right? There's kind of an imbued mutual destruction, but there's also this hope, this victory, right? You're going to have an offspring, and it's kind of vague because it's what we call a collective noun. Is this a group? Is this singular? And you get this kind of interplay throughout the rest of the Bible. Like, what does this mean? Is like they're going to be a group of the women's offspring that are going to triumph over this horrible situation we now find ourselves in? Are we going to have a single individual rise up and triumph? There's evidence that Adam and Eve even think that there's going to be an individual. There's evidence in the phraseology that Eve thinks it's Cain. Like, she thinks Cain is going to be the one. Like, this is the one who's going to triumph over the serpent. But we got the purpose of all of mankind given to us right at the beginning. We see basically our problem, and we're given this promise for how God is going to fix this. There is going to be this war between the offspring, but I'm going to continue my purposes with you. Like, I mean, that's one of the things that is inherent in the putting the enmity between the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of the woman. That in itself is a blessing, right? Like, I'm not going to let you go along with the serpent. There is going to be a pull. There is going to be a war. I am going to preserve a people through this. I'm not just going to give you all to the serpent. That's not going to be the way that this ends. And we get this culmination of things get really, really bad, and then we have the flood, and it is a cataclysmic judgment on all of mankind, save for Noah and his family, right? It is a cataclysmic judgment, and what instigates this is the evil heart of mankind is the first. We start to get this heart language that becomes really, really important in the Pentateuch. I think not often given enough space. We get this heart language. Right? Like, the problem is with the hearts of the people. And that doesn't change, does it? Because what happens after the flood? God says the same thing. The heart of mankind is wicked, like totally corrupt. So the flood doesn't change it. But what we do get is this picture, this cataclysmic judgment, this kind of picture of final judgment where God does preserve a remnant. And then he says, one of the things that he adds, one of the things he builds into his, like, I'm continuing. So that's one of the things that happens with the Noahic covenant. I'm continuing my purposes, right? There's that kind of publication of Adam. I'm going to keep going, but I'm going to add some additional stipulations. I'm not going to wipe you all out until I'm done, right? So that's one of the things inherent in Noah is like, this is going to continue. Creation is going to continue. The world will continue. I will preserve it, right? I'm going to preserve this until I've completed my purposes because I have to do it because you guys, there's a heart problem here. There is a heart problem. The heart is deceitful. Their hearts are wicked. It's nothing but evil thoughts, and that is before and after. And that kind of culminates in Babel. We talked about that last time, where mankind wants to build a tower to heaven. What's that about? It's like not just the skyscraper or the height. It's like, no, we want to supplant God. We want to fully continue the fall of Adam, right? It's the same thing going on, even though it's different language. It's I'm deciding for myself. I want to replace God, right? Like the problem of sin can often be summarized with rebellion. I want to replace God. I want to be God myself. That's what's going on with Adam, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's what's going on with Babel. We're going to be God. We're going to build ourselves a tower into the heavens, and then we'll take over that position. And God, again, stops that, and we come to Abraham. And God makes a covenant with Abraham, and we mentioned you get this really interesting stuff going on in Genesis where all this global cosmic stuff is happening. 2,500 years of history is covered in the first 11 chapters of Genesis at least, and then all of a sudden we zoom in and we spend the next 39 chapters on just one family and just 4 generations of that one family. And it's because, not because we have a bunch of moralistic tales from this family. It's because, God is doing something important with this family relative to the narrative, right? Relative to the macro structure, relative to God, all of God's creation purposes. So he makes a covenant with Abraham. And what did he promise Abraham? What were the 3 or 4, depending on how you parse it, things that God promised Abraham when he made a covenant with Abraham? So first of all, you remember the story, right? God calls Abraham out of where? Ur, yep. God calls Abraham out of Ur. Does anyone know, like, roughly where that is? Kind of up Babylon, right? So, this is before what would have been called Babylon, but it's up in that, bad spot, generally speaking, in the Bible. That's a bad place. And God calls pagan Abraham out of Ur, and he sends them to, which would be the promised land and the land of promise. And what does God promise him? What does God say? As he's like, I'm going to make a covenant with you, and there's a sign involved. The relationship is formalized. We have circumcision. And what does God say to Abraham? What were the things that he promises him? Offspring. So seed, that's one. Offspring. Yeah, blessing. So sometimes people parse that in 2. It's like, I will bless you, and I will bless all the nations through you. So we got offspring, blessing, and what's the final thing he promised him? Land, right? So land, seed, blessing. which again, that sounds an awful lot like what was happening with Adam, right? I'm going to bless you, you're going to multiply, and we're going to have a land together where I walk with you and I live with you. And then it looks like that's lost. That's, again, it's coming back with Abraham. It's like, no, I'm keeping going with my promise, and I'm going to do this with you, Abraham. I'm going to do this with your family. I'm going to continue my creation purposes. I'm going to fulfill them, and through you, I'm going to bless all the other nations. So through your family, I'm going to restore this. There's going to be redemption. You also see God said to Abraham, I'm going to make a name for you. I'm going to make a name for you, which is what did they say in Babel? You guys remember what phraseology? So we're going to make a name for ourselves. We're going to make a name for ourselves. We're going to supplant God. We're going to make ourselves play in heaven. And God puts an end to that. But he says to Abraham, like, I'm going to make a name for you. I'm going to do it, right? In harmony with my purposes. And so you see how what's happening is telling a coherent story as we go, right? It's not just a collection of tales in Genesis. This is a coherent story. This is what I started with. This is what I created. We're seeing these problems going out, but you see how I'm going to continue at every step of the way. Then we get the big thing in the whole structure of the Bible of Exodus, and we're just going to call this the Mosaic Covenant. And what happens here? The two-sentence version. What's the context for this covenant? Where is this given? When is this given? We're calling it the Mosaic Covenant. Yeah, Ten Commandments, which was on where? Mount Sinai, right? So we have the Exodus pattern where the people have now ended up in slavery, the descendants of Abraham, right? So remember, we continue the narrative story. It's like, we got the descendants of Abraham, and they've multiplied. But now they're in Egypt, and things are not going very well. They're slaves, and they're not in the promised land, and things are looking very down. But then God rescues them. It says he remembers the covenant that he made with Abraham, right? I'm not done with that. Never ever done. Continuing the purpose that I've had for creation from the very beginning. He remembers that covenant. So he does this act of deliverance, becomes a very important pattern, very important motif in the Bible, this act of deliverance, rescue from slavery, but it's not just rescue so you're not slaves anymore, right? It's rescue so we can get you to the promised land. And it's not just, so you can be free and do whatever you want in the land. It's so that I can come live amongst you. You remember that's the final third of the whole book of Exodus. It's all about the tabernacle. Why? Why are these building instructions that just I don't get? And because this was the culmination of the Exodus salvation, is I come and live amongst you. The same thing that was back in the garden where God walked with Adam. I'm going to come and I'm going to live amongst you. And the important piece in between those, so I rescue you from slavery and I'm going to come live in amongst you, is the giving of the law, and that's the important order. He rescues them from slavery, he gives them the law, and then he gives them the tabernacle where he comes to live amongst them. So he's continuing. So the Mosaic Covenant, these are the stipulations. As you're now going to be an image of what I've wanted to do with all of creation, what I was doing in the garden. Now the promised land is kind of like a little new garden. It's kind of like a new little mini creation, kind of like a temple in miniature, even though we have a temple inside. This is the place, this is the context where we will have life together. You will be my people. You will be blessed within the promised land. I will live amongst you. I will dwell with you here in this space. But there are stipulations. There are criteria. There are laws in order to enjoy this life together. And so we get the Mosaic Covenant, which has the most extensive covenantal stipulations, right? All the laws, but also a huge provision, because a huge part of the Mosaic Covenant, in fact, a huge part of the structure of the Pentateuch is all about what a word. What a word is huge in the laws of the Mosaic Covenant. Atonement, right? It's huge. In fact, it is arguably the center of the Pentateuch, which is the center of Leviticus is Leviticus 16, which is the Day of Atonement, and that's the center of the Pentateuch. And that kind of structuring is often intentional. And you see that it's right there at the center. It's the center of Leviticus. So yeah, we have lots of other laws. We have laws about what you can wear and what you can eat and social relationships and all these things. But all throughout them, we have this provision for atonement. So it's not. So there is a real sense. Sometimes people summarize the covenants as either unconditional or conditional. It's probably better to say most of the covenants have both elements. Maybe you say Noahic, pretty unconditional. But most of the covenants have both elements. Some element of where there's things that are part of this that are unconditional and things that are conditional. You have to fulfill certain conditions. And so there is this conditional sense of the Mosaic covenant. You have these laws. You're called to obey. If you don't obey, there are the very specific punishments that you will receive. All the way culminating in exile is the ultimate one. But there's also provision of grace. There's the image, at least, even in the Mosaic covenant, this constant theme of atonement. You need something, right? And so this becomes super clear here. How do we fix what's gone wrong? Well, there has to be something. Something has to fix this. There has to be blood shed. There has to be restitution. There has to be redemption. Something has to be fixed. And you get this very clearly, even in the structure of the Pentateuch, where at the end of Exodus, Moses isn't able. We miss this sometimes. He isn't able to go into the tent. It says he has to speak to God from outside the tent. And then you get the book of Leviticus, which again centers on atonement. And then after the book of Leviticus, the very first line of Numbers 11, or of Numbers 1, is Moses went into the tent. That's intentional. He couldn't get in the tent. Then you have Leviticus. Now he can get in the tent, right? So we've got this building on what's going on. But then we also still have this heart problem that repeats itself over and over and over. Even in the giving of the Mosaic covenant, particularly the republication that's found in Deuteronomy, you guys have a heart problem, Moses says. You're like kind of what we saw back with Noah. You guys have a heart problem. You're not going to obey. You've got these stipulations, you've got these laws, but you're not going to keep them. You eventually are going to experience all the punishments that are threatened because I know you aren't going to keep them because you have a heart problem. What you need is a new heart. And so it's not resolved. It's this big tension at the end of the Pentateuch where God has created the world. He's got this purpose. There is this problem, and he's got a promise that he's so dedicated to fulfilling, but there's this tension that's just left open. In fact, that's intentional with all the conditional and unconditional elements in each of the covenants, right? There's conditional and unconditional elements like, well, God's made all these unconditional promises, but then there's all these conditional elements, and we're just going to violate those every single step of the way. We've got this really difficult tension, and we've got this heart problem, and it's not resolved. It's deliberately left there. You're supposed to feel that tension. You're supposed to feel like, how is this going to resolve? What is God going to do about my heart problem? And then when we get into the coming in the promised land, one of the things Judges does as a book is it makes you go, well, in some way, you're going to need a king, right? We see things go very, very poorly in the time of Judges, and then at the end of the book, there's that refrain. They were doing whatever they wanted, whatever was right in their own eyes. They were being little gods, just doing whatever they wanted. There was no king in the land. So it makes you think like, okay, somehow God is going to answer this with a king. And then, of course, we come to David, and we get the Davidic covenant where God promises to David, I'm going to build a house and a dynasty for you. I'm going to do this with you. And we also get this interesting verbiage about David, which was he was a man after God's own heart. So again, we're dealing with that heart issue. The whole thing is like, okay, we have a heart problem. We also need a king. Again, so there's this tension. How is this going to resolve? Well, one of the things we need is we need a king with the right heart. We need a king with the right heart. We need a representative. We need a leader who's got the right heart. And so we get this in the Davidic covenant where we get this little picture. God says, I'm going to get a king with the right heart, and I'm going to do something through you, through your family specifically. I'm going to build my kingdom. I'm going to bring to fruition everything that I've been promised and been building. And then it goes very, very poorly with all of David's descendants, doesn't it? The kingdom splits. We get very, very few out of David's. On the southern kingdom, you only get 8 good kings. The northern kingdom, you get none. And it just goes very, very poorly. And so you get this effect as you read through Samuel and Kings. You get this very clear effect, this sense of, ooh, we need a king like David, but better. That's kind of the effect that happens as I read this. Like, I need a king like David, but then remember when we were preaching through Samuel, David had all these failures, and things kind of went poorly. And it gives you this, the impression the narrative is making. It's like, you need someone like David. You need a David. But you need a better David, someone who's not going to fail you and someone who's not going to die. Those are important. Not fail you, not die. If he dies, then what? Okay, even if he's the best in the world and he dies and he's gone, you need someone who's not going to fail you, not going to die. And then you read Kings, and it's like, no, every step of the way. It's kind of like an intentional letdown. That's part of the effect of Kings. Is like at every step, you're kind of like hoping it's the next guy. Like I'm hoping this is the guy. I'm hoping this is the guy, and it's just always a letdown. As you get this effect where, man, God, we see kind of more clearly than we've ever seen in redemptive history what we need. So we know what we're looking for, and we keep getting let down. We keep getting let down. And this is at this time period, you start to get promises in the prophets. I'll put it in dots. Well, I'll do it this way. Of the new covenant, right? We start to get talk of a new covenant, and we'll just dot it because it's not yet. It's not inaugurated yet. But this, you start to get language in the prophets as early, at least as Jeremiah before the exile, or in Jeremiah happening right before the exile, and as well, and Ezekiel a little bit before, and then Isaiah about 140 years before the Babylonian exile. You start to get this language of a new covenant. Like, I'm going to do something. And what's one of the big things that God says he's going to do in the new covenant? In fact, one of the clearest passages in Jeremiah, in that block in Jeremiah 30, 31, 32, 33, what is one of the key promises that God says that he's going to do with regards to the new covenant? Yeah. Julian, because I've already been emphasizing. Well, go ahead. Say it out loud. A new heart, right? A new heart. He said, I'm going to give you a new heart. And he's like, and the whole issue with David and the Davidic branch. And so we start to get this hope, this very clearly expressed hope in the prophets. It's like there is going to be a culmination of all of this. You are going to get a final covenant. And through that covenant, it's not 100% clear yet, but through that covenant, it's going to involve the giving of the Spirit. It's going to involve a new heart. It's going to involve a new heart, and this is going to be mediated by a perfect king. You're going to get it. You're going to, again, so you start to get the hope. The hope becomes more and more clear as it goes. You don't know how it's going to happen, but it starts to become more and more clear. I need a perfect king who's going to fix my heart. That becomes like the desire in the narrative, like just naturally as you read it. Like, oh, I need a perfect king who's going to represent the people, who's going to be God's perfect representative, who's going to do everything well, and he's going to got to give me a new heart. And I don't know how any man could do that, but that starts to become the hope, and then it becomes the explicit promise. Like, I am going to do that. I'm going to give you a king who's going to fix your heart, who's going to fix your heart issue. And then, of course, this is culminated where the new covenant is actually inaugurated, enacted in Christ, and it becomes clear where we're given the culmination of everything. New Adam, new Noah, second Adam, right? Perfect David, great David's greater son, the perfect David, the king we've been waiting for, the one who doesn't fail in all the other ways, and like Hebrews says, who doesn't have that whole little pesky problem of he dies and leaves us, right? That's a big problem. Dies and leaves us. Doesn't have that problem, and better yet, as God incarnate, as God the Son, he is able to mediate a new heart. That's one of the things Ezekiel says. And so you get this interplay. I think it's more clear in the Old Testament than some people give credit that our Messiah would be divine. One of the things God says in Ezekiel is like, all your shepherds keep failing you. I'm going to come and I'm going to be your shepherd. I'm going to be the shepherd. In Isaiah, where it talks about the righteous suffering servant, and it uses the language of, it uses divine language of him. It says he'll be high and lifted up. Isaiah only uses that language of God. And he says the servant in Isaiah 53, he's going to be high and lifted up. And so we get God coming in the flesh to answer all these things, to be the perfect king, and now to be a king who is able to change hearts. And through the covenant that he enacts in his own blood, which is actually able to cleanse our consciences, right? The blood sprinkled from Christ, which none of this could actually do, he's able to do. He's able to give new hearts. He's the perfect king. He's the one who can lead the way. He's the one who can actually be an example, right? Christ is not only an example, but he's the only one who actually can be, and he's the only one who can accomplish all the things that have been promised and anticipated and desired all throughout the narrative. It naturally culminates. I think it's one of the biggest problems. Obviously they're a big problem. But the biggest problem with a modern day Judaism where you only have the Old Testament, but when you read it, it has a natural a natural narrative that has a natural, like, we're waiting for something, and they've kind of become content with there is going to be no finish to this. Like, there's a whole strand of Judaism that's, like, in fact, probably the majority nowadays, that tends to be like just totally non-messianic. It's like, how does that work? Like, this is like, it's a story that's waiting for an ending, right? I heard one Jewish commentator interview a Christian, and he said he was making the point, like, all the morals and all the goodness and all, like, the understanding of God is already, like, from the New Testament, it's already in the Old Testament. He's like, so why do we need the New Testament? And, like, to an extent, I agree with that. Like, it's all there because it continued. It's one narrative. He says it's all there. Like, what do you need the New Testament for? Like, what does the New Testament add? That's kind of like asking, what the Fellowship of the Ring. We meet all the characters. We already know them all. Why do we need Return of the King? We're done. We've met all the characters. Like, yeah, the story's not over, though. The story's not over. We're waiting for the culmination. That's what's the problem. The story's not done. And then we get that finish in the person of Christ. And so we get the structure, and as I promised you right at the beginning of class, one of the utilities of this is this allows you to literally summarize the entire Bible in maybe a paragraph. Because you can do that with covenants. You can say God created mankind. He made a covenant with man. He had purposes for him. He was going to bless him, live together with him, and mankind was going to rule under him. Man rebelled. He rejected that and violated the terms of the covenant, brought death upon himself. And ever since, God has been working to both preserve his initial purpose and to redeem man out of that. He preserves people through judgment, as we see in the Noahic covenant. He re-emphasizes his commitment to complete his purposes, as he does in the Abrahamic covenant. He selects a family. He narrows this down. He gifts the reality of redemption. He clarifies the need that something's got to fix this. We need atonement in the Mosaic covenant. We get this really narrowed in to the fact that we need a king. This is made clear to us, and we're given provision of a king and hope for a king in the Davidic covenant, and a king specifically with a right heart who's going to fix our hearts. And we start getting hope for a new covenant where all that's going to come to pass, where we get a new king who's going to have the right heart and who's going to be able to fix our hearts. And so if people like say, how do you summarize the whole Bible? One of the ways you can do it is with the structure of covenants. You can summarize the whole Bible just using the covenants, and do that in a paragraph. You don't even have to be as long-winded as I was just now. You can use the covenants, and so that's one of the reasons why, just as evidence, like, yes, the covenants are kind of form this backbone, because you can successfully tell the whole story of the Bible just by using the covenants. All right, so that was a lot, but again, the main point was just to kind of give you the structure so that you have it in your brain as we work through our three big themes for the next 3 weeks. We're going to look at prophet, priest, and king, and as we said, we'll take one at a time. So 1 week will be prophet, next week will be prophet, and we'll start at the beginning, and we'll see how does the theme of prophet kind of appear at the beginning, and how does it work out across the covenants, across the timelines? Like, how does it unfold as we go? And then we'll do that with priesthood, and we'll do that with kingship, and we'll see how these things appear at the beginning and how they kind of unfold as we go. So you have this, and I'll turn this into a nicer looking handout so we can kind of have that as we work through these things. Final questions? All right, let's close in prayer. Lord, we do thank you so much for all that you have made and all that you have purposed. We thank you for the desire that you have to be in a covenantal relationship with your people, to have created this. We thank you for the new covenant. We thank you for King Jesus. We thank you that his heart was ever right before you, and we thank you that he gives us new hearts. And so we do pray that you would give us a boldness for the gospel, that we would spread the good news of this new covenant, and that more and more people would be covered by the blood of Christ and would enter into this relationship with you. We pray this all in Jesus' name for his glory. Amen. All right, 2 minutes. 2 minutes till service starts. We went late.